Fellows Program talk. This is one of our favorite things that we do at the Udall Center. I've said this before, but it would be lovely if we could all meet in our small conference room and enjoy lunch together. But I suppose Zoom is our next best option here. And I'm especially pleased today to welcome my colleague, Barron Gafford, who's a colleague of mine in the School of Geography, but also a collaborator of mine. So I'm really honored to have you with us today. And I'm going to turn it over now to Bob Verity, my colleague, to talk a little bit about the program and to introduce Greg. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. We always like doing this, as Andrea said, and we're getting good at it. This is the 32nd year that we're doing it, so we'll get it right eventually. But as Andrea said, we really would prefer to have it in the room, and we've had as many as 25 people in that little room. Today we're expecting 15, which is a good crowd. The Fellows Program started in 1990, and two of the first fellows that we had were from geography. At the time, it was called Geography and Regional Development. That was Andrew Kirby and Sally Marston back in the spring of 1991 in ancient times. So we've had a lot of people from history, from geography over the years. Probably our second most represented department, sociology, would be number one. Today, Greg is going to talk about PV+, exploring the potential for co-locating renewable energy and agriculture from a socio-ecological perspective. Last week, we heard from Louise Roth, and we're still going to hear, I think it's next week, from Elizabeth Baldwin, right, April 21st. We had Tom Sheridan give a talk last semester as part of this year's cohort, and Shelley Rodrigo, who's also in this year's group, is going to talk next fall instead of this semester. So I think we're ready to go. Ordinarily, we would go around the table and say who we are. So maybe let's start with that. And let's just go around the horn here with Molly, and then I'll call on people so that there isn't any pause. Go ahead, Molly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Bryson. I am a program coordinator for the Udall Center. And so I just help organize all of this kind of stuff. And I'm happy to be here with you all today.
Well, Greg, we know who you are, so we'll just we'll turn to Andrea real quickly, and then Laura.
Hi, Andrea Gerlach, acting director at the Udall Center and a professor in the School of Geography.
Laura.
Hi, I think I know everybody here, but I'm Laura Lopez Hoffman, research professor at Udall Center and a professor at the School of Natural Resources and the Environment.
And Chris.
Hi, everybody. I had to put my sunset picture on because I'm going to announce my ex-affiliations to all things here. I'm the ex-director of the Udall Center, or the present director for a few more weeks, but on my way out. I also hold a position in the School of Geography and Development, but more importantly for this group, probably I'm an ex-Udall Center Fellow, working on some of the same questions that Greg is talking about, water energy nexus in a different guise and so forth. And just very briefly, I'll be moving on to Penn State University starting in July at a position in this Department of Ecosystem Science and Management.
Louise.
Hi, I'm Louise Roth. I'm a professor in sociology, and I am a current Udall Fellow, and I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago.
Carl. Carl is another former fellow.
Former fellow, Carl Bauer, School of Geography, Development and Environment. Former fellow, longtime fan.
And Melis.
Hi, nice to meet you all. I am Melis Renaud from the Office for Science and Technology at the Embassy of France, and I'm based in Los Angeles. And we're very happy because we signed this morning. We had the ceremony between CNRS in France and the University of Arizona. So this is amazing. So we're looking for more collaboration. And I'm actually organizing, along with iGlobe, an exciting event mid-May. And I think Greg might have heard of it. So we'll be in touch shortly, and I'm excited to be here with you today. Thank you.
And before we turn to Jessica, just a word that I sent a couple of photographs to Andrea and to Adriana yesterday of the 2008 inauguration of the original CNRS UMI here at the University of Arizona, which I led at the time between 2008 and 2010. So we're glad to see that the process is continuing. Jessica?
I'm Jessica Asbill-Case. I work for the Bureau of Reclamation. I am a program manager with water conservation grants, and I have been working with the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe on some of their solar desalination for wells. Thank you.
Great. Diana?
I'm Diana Liverman. I'm the director for a few more weeks of the School of Geography, Development and Environment. And it was actually being a visiting fellow at the Udall Center in 1994 that got me to become a faculty member at the University of Arizona. I was at Penn State, Chris, came to visit the Udall Center and stayed.
That's right, fall of 1994. Right, and then she joined the faculty a year and a half later. Valerie, another ex-fellow.
Yes, hi, I'm Valerie Trouet. I'm indeed, I'm a professor in the Laboratory of Triggering Research, former Udall Center Fellow, which I'm very excited about because it allowed me to write my book that's now published. And I also spent some time at Penn State long before coming here, but so come visit us, Chris, when you're tired of the Pencil Central PA boonies. You'll miss Tucson.
February and March, I'm coming.
Stephanie?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Buechler, and I know most of you, I think, and I am at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy and also the School of Geography and Development, and have been looking at gender and environment issues for many years, mostly in Mexico and also South Asia and here in Tucson. But I too am going to Penn State with Chris, and I will be working there with a program on gender equity in agricultural research and extension and at Penn State, and also working with Pennsylvania and international extension issues.
Great. And finally, Lydia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lydia. I am a postdoctoral scholar out of the Native Nations Institute in the Udall Center. My PhD work was actually around mining reclamation and copper mines. I'm a member of the Pascoyaqui tribe. And a lot of my work was really around soil science. So I'm really interested to see how you weave together these topics.
Great. So I think it's over to you, Greg. Go for it.
Great, thanks. Well, I guess I should announce I'm moving to Penn State. I'm just kidding. No, not at all. I'm glad to still be here for a really long time, I hope. And really grateful to the Udall. Just laughing at Diana's comment. Really glad to have had the opportunity to have this Udall Fellowship, which has really helped evolve my scientific research program, who I am as an academic and who I am as a community person, whether you define community more locally like Tucson or more regionally or globally. I started off as an ecologist, really studying, small scale interactions and vegetation dynamics in savannas. And even in that research, I was looking for application. And over the course of the last few years, as I'll talk about in a moment, we've been looking at modeling, like physically modeling ecosystems to do more deliverables of ecosystem services around food, energy, and water. And being in a geography department has really given me the flexibility and the ability to pursue that passion of understanding how that connects with people. major actors of ecosystems that aren't always acknowledged. So I'm going to share some slides real quick. Let's see, just a quick confirmation. Is everybody seeing that? Okay, thanks. Alrighty, I'm just going to ignore the chats for a little bit, but I'll check in in a moment so I don't get distracted. But yes, I'm talking about this. We've modified it from, we've been talking about agrivoltaics, this mashup of agriculture and photovoltaics, but part of that evolution has been that we've been changing this to talking about PV plus, PV being photovoltaics and plus being how can we do more within the traditional photovoltaic installations that we've seen over the recent decades. And doing this to explore the potential for co-locating agriculture writ large, whether that's pollinator habitat or grazing or forage production or food production, alongside renewable energy. And we're trying to tackle this more from a socioecological perspective, which is part of what I learned about in my Udall experience from working with your intermillennial leader, Andrea. So the reason we're digging into this is because we have these two major needs. We really want to expand the amount of renewable energy out there in the landscape. I feel like most of us on this call would agree with that. And we also want to find sustainable sources for food. Because both of those demands are growing because of population and the pressures on these are growing because of a changing environment, we're running into land use conflict. So we want more renewable energy out on the landscape. And if you look at this graphic, which looks like daytime temperatures, especially in the summer, this is actually kilowatts per meter squared that can be produced from renewable energy. And you can see this, hot spot in the Southwest. And we know this, we mostly live in this region here on this call. These are places that see tons of sunlight. The flip side of that is that the efficiency of solar panels, which is what this graphic is, declines linearly with temperature. So if we have these places around the globe that are super sunny and have this potential for renewable energy production, how do we balance the fact that as the climate warms, that these panels become less efficient? In fact, if you think about this graphic, the left edge is about 25 degrees Celsius, which is about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that means pretty much every day it's above 77 degrees outside and sunny, your solar panels are underperforming. And so there's an industry-wide challenge that we're trying to address. And so the question is, we're not the only place on the planet that has, this relationship happening. So as we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, how do we increase the global percentage of renewable energy out there on the landscape? And how do we actually improve the efficiency of that energy when we know that the efficiency is temperature sensitive and is likely to decline? At the same time, we don't want to forego just paving everything with renewable energy. We have to think about the fact that we also have many people who don't have consistent access to food and nutrition. So how do we balance these energy targets with these food targets like Sustainable Development Goal number 2, which are related to universal access to safe and nutritious food, and not just introducing some food, but actually doubling the productivity, especially with it related to small scale producers. We have all of this interest in investing in rural infrastructure around agriculture, but both of these demands are on the same parcel of land, and because a lot of times people are needing both of these things simultaneously. And because there's a third leg to this stool, how do we not do these things and just forego the ability to have clean water and sanitation? So there's really trade-offs, right? There's trade-offs associated with any of these land use decisions. And many of you study these either from a physical or a social science dimension. And what we're saying is that that food, energy, water nexus pivot point is right there out there in the landscape. My job is to put some numbers to some of that from a physical science basis, but clearly that requires understanding what people want. Many of us agree we want a happy planet. I don't know that it has a smiley face right now, but let's turn that frown upside down and get it smiling again. But how do we do that? Part of that is this investment in renewable energy that can mitigate other climatic pressures, increasing that global energy efficiency. But you have to do this mindfully. We can't just get rid of biodiverse hotspots. Even what might seem like a boring plains kind of picture of like Kansas grasslands, it actually has a huge amount of biodiversity. And a lot of those plants are actually supporting the pollinators that enable our food production. So how do we introduce renewable energy without having a negative impact on pollinator habitat? How do we not take over the lands that are currently available to produce food or even marginally able to produce food? Part of this comes from the fact that renewable energy is really expensive to move that energy around. So you don't want to just stick all of your renewable energy out in the middle of the Nevada desert, because transporting that power is very expensive. By some estimates, about $1 million a mile. So if we're not going to put the solar or the wind power way out around from the city, and we've determined for the most part that renewable energy on rooftops is great, but it's not going to solve our bigger challenge, where do you put it? Oftentimes in those peri-urban areas where we already have food production. So how do we make decisions about that? And again, how do we not do any damage to our existing water system? And how can we actually turn this into a positive where we can boost the availability of water resources? Now, this challenge is already being felt there on the landscape just across the border in California. Many of these farmers who were formerly producing food production are just experiencing too much either interannual variability or lack of access to water, or rising costs of water that's shifting them to have to think about other decisions. And so you can actually do a Google Earth slide bar and watch lots of these landscapes that were formerly irrigation-fed agriculture switching over to renewable energy. But is that okay? What are the pros and cons of doing that? If we were in class, I'd wait for your answer, but especially with Zoom and your cameras off, I can't tell. I like this quote because it came from the Minister of Agriculture for Australia, who was actively working to shut down renewable energy production until he started to think about this potential for co-location. And he said that farming and renewable energy projects are both critical to the state's regional economy. And that part about the economy is where the rubber really hits the road, right? That's where people fill it in their wallets and we start to make these decisions. So I want to start off by talking really quickly, or briefly at least, not too quickly, about how I came to this and where we're headed. So I was working out there on the landscape, thinking about native grasses and tree relationships, how land management and cattle grazing influence the relative abundance of mesquite trees versus grasses. And at the same time, I was hearing these challenges about renewable energy conflicting on the landscape with our other uses. And I started to wonder, could we actually do both? And I like this quote from Einstein. I joke that I Googled it twice, so it's probably true that he said this, but look deeper into nature and you can understand everything better. That feels especially true during our Zoom times. But what we're looking at here is a picture of a Palo Verde and all of the plants, they're able to be supported in its understory. So plants can grow in the shade of trees. Could they grow in the shade of solar panels was some of the questions. And being trained in ecology, I know that there's good reasons that these plants actually not only survive, but thrive in this kind of environment. And so we wanted to see how well we could construct an ecosystem. In ecology, we call these novel ecosystems, kind of a mashup of things that you wouldn't have found together otherwise. And we're really wondering, can you co-locate agriculture and renewable energy production to get benefits across food, energy, and water realms? So this agrivoltaic system, as we're calling it, agriculture plus photovoltaics, we're wondering if we could use it to adapt our food systems to survive through periods of drought and temperature stress. Just imagine in this picture, the solar panels here are the Palo Verde or mesquite tree. Could they actually provide protection from the midday sun, which induces water stress, temperature stress, and actually an overabundance of energy can create free radical damage, just like it does to us as humans, as animals. That same thing happens to plants. And so knowing this knowledge about vegetation has allowed us to think about this as in a systems perspective. Can we actually improve our renewable energy production? This is where it works. It's really nice to be able to work with people on campus who are in physics. Because remember, we learned about this graphic earlier about the efficiency and the decline in efficiency of our solar panels with temperature. If we weren't such a collaborative and convergent place here at the university, I wouldn't be working with Alex Cronin in physics and Neil Armstrong, not the astronaut, to understand these kinds of relationships. And so, can we actually use the transpiration from plants to cool down those solar panels? Just like our skin perspires, whenever plants open their pores to let carbon dioxide in, water escapes, and that's transpiration. So could we use that slow misting that comes out of plants to cool down solar panels, which would actually increase their efficiency? And the last part is around water. Could we actually use this kind of system to ease our dependence on irrigation? Just think if you spilled your water bottle out in the sun versus the shade, even at your own home, where would it stay wet longer? In the shade, right? So let's use some of these really obvious principles to try to solve some of our biggest challenges. By having the irrigation of these plants being the shade of solar panels, the hypothesis at the time was that maybe it would actually reduce the amount of irrigation we needed. So co-locating these things can have different kinds of benefits. If you think about the system on the left, this is a renewable energy system, and we've given up a lot of the things from that landscape for energy production. And so that's what you get, energy production. The flip side is all the way on the right, food production. Again, we have to make lots of decisions about how we utilize our space and our water resources to produce food. Sometimes you'll get extra boost out of here, like pollinators, if it's a crop that you let go to flower before fruiting. But by mixing the two in this hybrid system, we're saying that maybe you can boost the revenue. You can see the wider bars here in this hybrid agrivoltaic system with the added benefit of conserving water. The challenge is we have to get past this either or in terms of our land allocation to generate some more ecosystem services. And when I say get past this either or, it's not just a simple mindset. There's laws and there's policies related to that too. All right, so just a quick bit of science, because I know not all of you are physical science or plant folks. This is the question we always get, especially from the panel reviewers. Can plants be grown in the shade? Can they even handle that? And we like to say, your biology teacher didn't lie to you. Plants do need more sunlight to function. But you do see this linear increase as you increase the amount of light in plants' photosynthesis. The nice fact that we're learned here is that by increasing light, you eventually hit this plateau point where plants don't do any more photosynthesis. You don't need to understand the units, just know that this bright sun is our sun levels outside here around Tucson and many drylands around the world. Growing in the shade of a solar array reduces your light level by about 2/3. But look what's here. If we cut back 2/3 of the light, we don't cut back 2/3 of the photosynthesis because we have this understanding of plant biology. At the same time, let's look at that graph. Y-axis is still photosynthesis, but now this is temperature. So this is plant function in relation to temperature. And plants are like us. They don't love it cold. They don't love it super hot. They like it somewhere in between. And this is, in the open sun, your temperature, and how you can be on the neighborhood of 5 to 7 degrees cooler on that leaf surface in the shade. And that's typically closer to that optimum point. So it's a simple trade-off issue here. Can a small reduction in photosynthesis in terms of their maximum capacity be offset by the fact they're growing in cooler temperatures and often with more water? So to test this, we built the Biosphere 2 Agrivoltaics Learning Lab. That's Biosphere 2. Imagine most of you know that. This is one of our little tools, a little portable photosynthesis machine. And so we'll just talk about a few physical science findings before getting on to the rest of it. Let's walk through food, energy, and water. Well, here's some of our, one of our master's students, now a PhD student in geography, and these others are college students from around the country, LA, Illinois, and Ohio, who came for an REU program. And we were measuring these plants under both an agrivoltaic and a controlled setting. And I'll spare you the physical science details, but Basically, in all of these graphs, the plants out in the open sun are shown in red. The plants in a photovoltaic or agrivoltaic system are in blue. And for this paper that published in 2019, the end of 2019 in Nature Sustainability, we showed that chiltepine pepper, this native pepper to our region, and tomatoes really loved that environment. Jalapenos did a little bit less carbon uptake, but with a lot more water savings. And ultimately, we were able to produce per plant about 3 times as many chiltepines and about twice as many tomatoes. So that's a win in terms of food production. And that was 1 year in our big collective of agrivoltaic research sites around Southern Arizona, including Biosphere 2, Rincon and University High School, and Monzo Elementary. We've been able to measure these impacts across a suite of different types of food and food types. So that's food. Let's jump into energy. Remember that fact that we talked about how panels are sensitive to temperature and they like to be cooler? Well, on this graphic, we're looking at traditional photovoltaic panels in gray and those agrivoltaic panels in blue. And without getting into the weeds here, you can see that the cooler temperatures in this agrivoltaic system were present. And that actually increased not only the panel efficiency, but reduced the wear and tear on these systems. That average cooling was about 9 degrees Celsius in the summer. So we're talking again about a significant move up the efficiency graph here. And ultimately that meant more production. So finally, let's move into water. This is an irrigated system, much like most of our food production here in Southern Arizona and the Southwest. And each one of these spikes, these rises in soil moisture through time is because of an irrigation event. And so you can see, and again, the agrivoltaics and in the control setting, we're irrigating at this point every other day. And so we measure these things. We have sensors in the ground to measure the amount of soil moisture after each irrigation pulse and through time. And we can see that the microclimatic area under an agrivoltaic system was so much cooler and had so much less direct sunlight that the water lasted longer in the soil. So let's zoom in on that. We can see that the soil levels in an agrivoltaic system after 2 days, so right before that next irrigation pulse, was the same as it was in a control or a traditional growing system after about 2 to 3 hours. Right? That's significant. That is a significant amount of water savings, such that we've now introduced another treatment at that Biosphere site where we actually cut back the irrigation we deliver by 50%. So that we can actually say, not only do we see this soil moisture lasting longer, not only do we see more production in many of the crops, but can we actually just give them half the water in the first place? So what can we do in terms of marginal lands? Can those now become more arable lands? And we're thinking globally, in addition to regionally, both north and south, thinking about the non-arable or barely arable lands to the south in Mexico and to the north in some of our native nations. And can we actually reduce our irrigation water use? That question was the first time I, as a young physical scientist, before I got as gray, realized that I needed to talk more to humans, because I thought, hot damn, look how much water we're saving. Everyone is going to love this. Only our water law is kind of crazy, right? And this is when we told some of the farmers that you could reduce your watering by about half. Isn't that great? And we started to hear, I don't want to reduce my water use. You know, if I don't use as much this year, I don't get as much next year. I don't want to give up that safety net of having the opportunity to utilize water or to sell it downstream. And so this is when I really started to understand that I had gone a little bit backwards. I'd gone the typical physical science pathway, at least, of chasing down some findings without fully understanding the implications or who was looking for the implications of my work. All of this was summarized in a paper, as I mentioned, and let me just pause there real quick. I don't want this to be too lecture-y. Any questions before I move on?
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
Hey,
I
Laura.
have some questions. It's Laura. How are you? I haven't seen you in a while.
I know. Great. You?
Yeah, good to see you. Okay, so the crops that you've chosen are, small kind of crops that need a lot of hand tending. I'm sure you've
Yes.
had this question before.
Yes.
So just a few questions off the top of my head. Does the infrastructure, the solar infrastructure, make it at all harder to harvest? I don't imagine, but I'm just asking.
Great. I'll dig more into that one in a minute. But
Okay.
it certainly determines what you can grow. And around here, like with cotton, for example, cotton, the pesticide is still regularly applied to that plant, and it's an aerial spray. And so you definitely don't want a canopy of solar panels. So yes, there are things immediately that are taken out of the opportunity zone.
Some crops are taken out because
Yes.
of the, okay. And then do the panels at all interfere? I mean, most of our crops are irrigated, but in other locations, to what extent would the panels interfere with rainfall that some crops might need, or just
Great.
only going to work in irrigated areas?
No, that's a really good question. Let me save that one too. So now I know I have those two to make sure I speak to as we show some slides.
I'm sorry, I guess I jumped ahead here.
No, that's great. That helps me make sure I say the right things. Anybody else, or keep going? Okay, there'll be more chances.
Greg,
Oh.
I have a question. Sorry.
You know.
Hey, Greg, thanks. Well, I'm not seeing anything. Anyway, I was wondering, of the crops that do well and the ones that do not so well, do you have an explanation, or is there anything to be learned from that? Like which ones or why some do better than others?
Sure, great question. Yeah, let me go back to that one real quick. There we go. So yes, I'll show you about basil in a moment. Basil is an example of a plant that is trying to reach out to capture more sunlight. So think about tropical plants in the understory versus our plants out here. Those have much larger leaves, whereas here we're hiding from the sun. And so that one's actually spreading out its photosynthetic capacity to capture light, which means a larger leaf, which is great when you harvest herbs. So that's something else we want to explore in terms of shade-grown teas or other herbs. The neutral is that bell pepper, where we didn't see better production, but we saw better water savings. Let's see, broccoli, that's a positive/negative. It really should be a negative. Broccoli is in the Brassicaceae family. It's a brassica. And that means it requires cold temperatures to trigger the head formation of that plant. So cabbages, broccolis, those sorts of things. What we ended up with was really large broccoli and cabbage plants that didn't make any heads. So if you wanted stir fry, you're good to go. If you wanted actually broccoli because you planted broccoli, not so great. Because the solar panels actually act like a cloudy night. Think about how cloudy nights versus open sky nights, how on cloudy nights we don't cool off nearly as much. And basically the solar panels act to trap all of that daytime radiation returning to the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So we get less of freezing, and we'll come back to that in a sec too.
So you get warmer nights, but cooler days.
Exactly.
Yeah, and with the basil, sorry, not to get all nerdy on this, but are you actually seeing shifts in carbon allocation to roots, stems, and leaves, or an overall increase in
Yes.
sort of the plant size and amount
Yeah,
of
it's like a good natural resource person, you're asking about below ground. And like
I'm sorry.
Like a good ecologist, I'll say we didn't dig it up.
You didn't dig it up.
Yeah, that's a really great question. That is part of one things we're trying to chase now is that carbon sequestration in terms of building up carbon pools in the soil through that rooting capacity. It's also a good question because my first inclination was that the plants were getting bigger because they didn't have to allocate as much to roots to capture water. But we're finding for the most part, they're just able to keep functional longer throughout the day. And by staying active a little bit longer each day, they end up harvesting more carbon through photosynthesis.
So your hypothesis is that they're not necessarily they're not being released and able to allocate more to leaves, rather they're just growing bigger all around.
Yes.
Interesting.
But yeah, more to come back on that. So along with that question about the changing climate under the solar array and the cooler nights, this is from Rincon University High, where we're working with high schoolers, obviously. And, you know, in both of these school settings, we have the kids ask us questions and help us drive the science. And, you know, they're high schoolers. They said, so if you've actually changed the climate, can you change the seasonality? That's a really good question, right? And so go for it. And so we give them half the beds to do their experiments for their different classes. And in this class, they started planting carrots, which is something you usually plant in October. They started planting them back in August. You know, the seeds on the right in the open sun, they just died for science. They never stood a chance growing in August because it's a fall crop. But look in the agrivoltaic setting, we started to get germination, such that by the time we're in the first week of November and you're getting some good carrot growth in the open sun, it's already harvest time in the agrivoltaics. And so this is one of the teachers harvesting a carrot for us. For the sake of time, I didn't walk through the same example with basil here, but that basil plant behind these two cuties is actually about as tall as me. So we ended up with perennial basil in the agrivoltaic system before we finally said, okay, that's enough. We need to move on. But through these two plants, we made 9 gallons of pesto. So I think it was time to go. So it really does change the seasonality. And here's a picture of agrivoltaic leaf of basil on the left versus a control basil on the right. So it is substantial per individual plant in terms of the volume of produce that you get from those leafy things. And this is, I mostly wanted to highlight this because I wasn't sure who would participate today. Make sure you know that our open doors for all of our agrivoltaics work with schools. As you have other questions or students with questions that are similar, we have a really great relationship through our community and school garden program. And it gets picked up in the news sometimes, like these students helping us discover they're here harvesting the chiltepines at their site. The boys love to show off by eating them raw in front of the girls who just think they're stupid. But that's, some of those patterns don't go away, right? And I also wanted to mention, you should Google Coast to Coast School Gardens next week. I think it's next week, yeah. We're gonna be featured as part of a national movement of school gardens from west to east, ultimately ending in DC. And our agrivoltaics garden gets to be highlighted in this site because we're doing this kind of experiential food, energy, water, nexus learning with the kids. And there's a really fun video, but it's embargoed, so I would confirm that I can't show it to you today. And we really try to come at the kids where they are. I mean, I have 8-year-olds, so I've stepped on tons of Legos. And so I was trying to use the Legos as an opportunity for the kids to low stakes establish some of their hypotheses. This is, my kid made this one. This is me here with more gray than I actually have. And versus a traditional PV setting. Hey there. But we actually have ended up teaming up with one of the 3rd place contestants from Lego Masters, and they have created their own version of an agrivoltaic system that you can go vote on. So if you just Google solar farm Legos, I think we're up to about 2,500 votes, and we need 10,000 for Lego to consider making it, but we still have a year and a half to get that. So maybe from today, we'll have even a few new people. So this is really how we approach some of this education work. And I get asked why all the time. And part of it, I think, is because the best way to understand people's concerns is to work with them in those settings. Sometimes teachers and parents bring their questions with them. And the other part is to show that kids are doing this work. It's not that complicated. It's not that scary. Solar is not that challenging to work in and around. And really the public is ready for a solution. When our paper came out in 2019, I didn't know what Reddit was really, but it trended on Reddit for 3 days. And ultimately we had 120,000 bumps where it stayed on their front page. And we got 1.2 thousand comments. And it wasn't the usual internet trolley kind either. It was very positive. And I think time and again, we've seen this interest from people to find energy, water, food solutions. And so it's really up to us as researchers and practitioners to find where's that boundary point. So we've been examining wider adoption, as I note here, exploring the application across the environmental gradient of US for just one place. Now I would say because of Udall support, we're also really thoroughly understanding the need to introduce research questions on the socio-political barriers. And again, I wrote PV plus in the title because we're looking at grazing and pollinator habitat, and this is mostly work with the National Renewable Energy Lab. So now I want to quickly show you 3 examples and the outcomes from the Udall Fellowship. So I was able to secure funding through NSF. Thank you, Udall, for helping with the course release to give me the mental space to dive into revisions and really push this. This is through the Human and Geographical Science Program, Human Environment and Geographical Science Program. And it's called Solar Sharing, Assessing the Potential of Co-locating Ag and Renewable Energy Production in Drylands. So we had all these findings down here in Southern Arizona. And a classic geography question is, if you understand these principles in one place, what happens when you apply them somewhere else? And we didn't jump to a completely different environment like Florida, but to a slightly different environment, a place where you do less rain-fed or more rain-fed agriculture, a place where there's a different socio-political climate. And that is now called Jack's Solar Garden. Look at this, empower your community, power your home. This is a community solar program with a community ag project underneath, but it wasn't always that way. So I'm gonna walk you through this really briefly. This is Grandpa Jack, as everyone refers to him. He's who the place is named after. When he passed on, he gave the land to Byron Cominet. So Byron inherited this land, but as is happening with a lot of our agriculture, Byron is not a farmer. Just because he inherited this land doesn't mean he's a farmer, right? And so here's a picture of the farm. That's the farm site there.
Really amazing.
Let's see, Bob, I think, there you go. And so Byron was trying to farm this land, and he was losing money every year, either by leasing it out or trying to keep alfalfa growing himself. And so Byron, being an environmental steward that he is, said, I'll just put it in renewables. But as I said, and you don't just make those decisions on your own, you have to go through hurdles. And so we began working with Byron to say, I met him as a friend of a friend on a trip up to Longmont one time. And we said, what if you keep it agriculture, but you add solar? Is there a way to ease some of the land use challenges? And so after working with Boulder County for more than a year, in 2019, Jack's Solar Garden was granted the ability to have agriculture plus renewable energy. And so that's what we have here now. So look at this picture using a drone overhead. One thing you might notice right away is it looks like a regular old farm. Here is the alfalfa land that's still alfalfa. Here's where the solar is now. This is a 6-acre plot. See how the grass is a little bit darker here? So this is a picture taken in September at the end of the growing season in Colorado. And you can see that water retention is keeping the green here. So it's extending the phenology before you even start the science. And so we've been diving into the socio-ecological system here. But look at this. As soon as Byron put in this this proposal to make this pivot, we started to get picked up in the news again. People are noticing our paper, asking questions. Can this be a way that farmers can now keep doing some of their agricultural work that they've been wanting to do, keeping the agrarian identity of a region? And without any data, all of a sudden people started to say yes. So it's really interesting to watch how Huffington Post and others grab the headlines. Just this week, we were in governing.com. I never talked to anybody at governing.com, so it's a reprint of something, but you learn a lot about the internet by being in the internet. So here is when I began to start a physical science measure here. I was driving a tiller, obviously pretty crookedly. And this is where we're measuring that microclimate and the impacts on terms of soil moisture and air temperature. This area on the left is with the solar panels at about 6 foot high off the ground. That is the traditional solar installation height in Colorado. And on the right is 8 foot. Byron intentionally made this a research site for us so we could see if by elevating the panels a little bit more, if you get additional benefits to really help us play with that cost benefit analysis. And this is work that we'll be beginning, was supposed to be on Saturday. They're having terrible weather this week, and so it's been pushed off another week. But we're working with Sprout City Farms. It's different than Sprouts, the grocery store, but Sprout City Farms will be doing the agronomy and the food production, both in our 2-acre site there and in the rest of Byron's site up there. So another good question that we get a lot of times is, does it taste any different? And so that's part of the thesis research of Mariah Rogers, our second graduate student in geography and the environment, who will be working on this project. And then we're also starting to dive into questions around what are the people's concerns about this when they start to see this example actually out there in the landscape. Byron gets about 8 to 10 visitors a week at this point, especially because he's right there on the highway and people are starting to see that it's a real thing. And that has allowed us to initialize some early conversations with other farmers who are thinking about what to do in light of this energy transition. And so you can see 2 of our colleagues, Andrea and Kirsten Engel, who have helped us write proposals and get some early data on this. Just checking time real quick. I won't go through the details of this, but just remember that each one of these, a natural system, a traditional photovoltaic, or a PV plus kind of system, have different ecosystem services, whether we're looking about energy benefits in terms of production, the localized cooling that those places do, or the localized heating that solar installations create. And we're really trying to understand this more broadly, a broader suite of services that are both anthropocentric and important to the viability of that ecosystem. And you can see carbon sequestration is on here too, and how we would expect a lot more carbon accumulation in the soil just because we have less of it being burned off. And part of this, we're thinking about this in terms of a term, land use efficiency. How can we optimize that by maximizing those services to increase the sustainability of farming on these systems? And I'm defining sustainability here in terms of us not having to add too many things to this system to allow it to continue to function. And if you're an agricultural system, sustainability means you continue to function in agricultural production in light of having a land use change implemented on top. And so it's really balance of, are there additional costs like the extra steel that's coming here versus the credits that come from leasing out that understory, producing food, saving water. And this is another one of those like soft benefits. It's hard to enumerate because it's so human dominated. The reduction in opposition and the potential to maximize zoning opportunities. So with our collaborators in Minnesota, we've been able to think about ways of using a carrot versus a stick approach. And so policy is actually helping change the practice up there. All of these places highlighted here in blue and in yellow utilize what's called a Pollinator Scorecard, where, including Maryland here, where when a energy producer is looking to lease out land from solar developers or farmers who want to get into solar production, they can score those who have the higher percentage of the facility that will be maintained in native plants, have the likelihood of attracting pollinators and other things like bees and bats. And so it's an example of how we can actually influence policy by telling them about the science of this work in hopes of creating at least some initiatives that might be helpful. And again, Arizona is not always leading the front on these sorts of things, but with notes like this about the Arizona Democratic legislators pushing for our farmers to use less water, something we all know is really important. How can we inform the science around using less water, but keeping food and energy production here? So this is one of the goals of our work. And this was really highlighted. Now, please don't try to read all these questions here, but in a social environmental dynamics of integrated social environmental systems proposal, NSF, with Andrea and others, looking at this agrivoltaic system across a wider climate gradient, with each one of these state boundaries also having very different socio-political characteristics, right? So understanding the structure and the function of an ecosystem in terms of that physical natural system and the socio-political system. Now, to get back to Laura's question about equipment, another grant that we've just wrapped up, just submitted a week before last to the USDA Sustainable Agricultural Systems, is because so often we get asked, you know, given my environment, what should I grow here? Again, I don't know everything about that. And so I suggest we need to do the science and kind of take estimates of plant production across climatic space and make some projections. But part of what this proposal is doing is really informing that modeling, but also the technical aspects of that system. So looking at the trackers that move the solar panels around to be more dynamic so that we can allow for large equipment to come through at certain times of year. Most of these trackers actually have the technology to go at nearly, 9 degrees from the ground surface, and so they can get out of the way for that tilling point. Because plants don't need a lot of attention from tractors except at that harvest point, you have to ask, is it really that plants need all of that light all the time, or do tractors really need all that access all the time, or is it at only certain important times like harvest time, and how can we work across that? And we'll leave this out for now. And so we're really trying to, in this landscapes project with the USDA, think about this nexus point between large scale research, the modeling that has to happen, and the integration with education and extension officers so that we can really spread the word about the potential and the limitations around agrivoltaics so we can make some advances. And I think I better end with one last example of how we're going global with this work. Working with the University of Sheffield, we got this project funded called Harvesting the Sun Twice. Just think about it, the solar panels are harvesting the sun and the plants are harvesting the sun as well, to enhance energy and food production in East Africa. And so thankfully I got to go to Nairobi, where we were able to check out some potential sites and talk with people on the ground about what they need. I love this picture because I look like some kind of giant. I don't remember everybody else being so short, but here is us visiting some people at Latia Farms, which was kind of like our Monzo Elementary, a training station and experiential education place for people interested in food production. And this project from the physical science aspect is being managed by a shared postdoc at the University of Sheffield. And the social dimensions are being driven by our collaboration with Arid Lands here at the university. And this is our graduate student, Diana Gitu, who is currently back in Kenya, who's hosting the interviews with locals who are thinking about their challenges in terms of food production and energy accessibility, and the local governments, regional governments, and the national governments, each of which are a barrier and an opportunity for change. This is what the schematic looks like when we're trying to think about the different benefits that come from co-location. And here's the drawing of what we're hoping to install. The ground is being prepared, and all these concrete pylons have been installed as of last week, but I don't have any pictures to show you. I think for sake of time, I'll just stop here and see what kind of questions you have.
So Greg, I had one. I mean, this is an amazing project, the way it's taken off. But as you start to get all these popular articles and all this interest from the private sector, I'm wondering if you're feeling anxious about the intellectual property, the balance of, changing the world through making sure that you can secure the grants and support the students and get credit for the work. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I have to laugh because I know Val is thinking I told you so.
Oh.
Because she did. I remember years ago, back when we could get together, Val saying, you should really think about patents. And I thought at the time, you can't patent the fact you stuck a plant under a solar panel. Probably missed a lot of opportunities, and certainly according to our own university lawyers. Once it was published in Nature, it was over. Once you publish it, that ship has sailed. I think part of what we've tried to think about ways of commercializing this is if we can make it into more of a modular type of thing where we could introduce all of the solar packed, solar infrastructure and the food parts into a shipping container so that we could deploy these in, refugee camps where they lack both food and energy access, or deploy them into other regions. But that's another example of convergent research because that requires engineering, all kinds of other questions around law and policy. And I'd say we're just not there yet. But yes, I would have a great conversation with someone else who was thinking about that balance between trying to change global practice and trying to protect intellectual property. I will say the most disappointing thing that's happened in the last 2 years is when we were cited in the Department of Energy's new program on agrivoltaics, and then we weren't funded because we really helped get this on the landscape and push it forward so much that by the time DOE had a program around it, they're like, well, you've already done this. And it's like, it was a very good challenge for Kim Patton and everyone else at RII who similarly were bamboozled, but I think that's just forced us to hustle more and chase this down.
Yeah, and just as a follow-up, of course, the School of Geography Development Environment, we're struggling to own you in competition with Biosphere too, because you've got a school appointment. So we want our share of the glory for the work you do.
Thanks.
Hey, Greg, I have a question on the policy front. I wonder whether there's some kind of an intermediate audience for your scientific findings, both in terms of some of the plant ecology, but also the local scale social questions of adoption. And that is, I think it's important to have findings associated with types of systems, the degree of choice you may have, adoption, but then really trying to get ambassadors or promoters who are probably going to be some kind of policy intermediaries, policy agents, who are then going to try to get it into state and federal programs. So farmers are going to adopt it in the degree to which obviously it makes sense from local production types of questions, labor constraints, costs, all those kinds of things. But farmers and adoption, particularly at a broader scale, is going to respond to incentives and programs that are going to help drive this forward. So what do we understand about what those policy intermediaries are, who they might be, and what kinds of information they may need to get program opportunities like this fed into the U.S. Farm Bill or the new infrastructure bill that's being discussed in Washington?
Yes, great question, Chris. And I think this is really the cusp of where we're at. So at this point, Andrea and Kirsten and I have submitted 3 proposals asking these various types of questions. We realized most recently that unlike a lot of the physical science where you have preliminary data saying, look, this works at least at this scale, help us study it more broadly, we lacked the social science data in terms of those early conversations. And so that's actually why Andrea and I have tried to recruit a graduate student to dig into those kinds of interviews right now. And actually Kirsten Engel over in law has. But you're spot on in terms of where we're at in terms of the learning. The nice thing about the Colorado site is that I'm on the board of directors for the, we have now created a Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center. That's kind of like our Monzo efforts there, but I'm on the board with some of the people who are on that Boulder County Corporation Commission and asking them informally, like, why did you think this was okay? What were you nervous about when you first started this? The first time you heard this, did you think that's absolutely crazy? And what kind of information led you to think maybe this could be something? So that we can provide some of those insights. The flip side is continuing to work with people from law like Kirsten, who knows what it takes to transform information into law. So utilizing examples like the IPCC report, and I forget the name of that cool, the Project Drawdown, I was just looking at my bookcase, which has like those clean, flashy kind of one pagers so that we can try to turn that corner, because you're exactly right, that's where we're at. I'll just say the last part is, I think some of our people who are going to help us make that change are the PV industry. And so just last week I was in Pinal County, all masked up, and because they'll call and say, what should I plant here? I heard you talking about this. We don't want to use a lot of water. We're not getting in the farm business. This is what it looks like. What can you do here? And again, that's another extension question. That is like, okay, maybe you could grow chiltepines there. That's a super high value. You could have hand harvesting, like, but I don't want to do any of that. I don't want to be a farmer. And so we've been talking about blue agave, which I think could do really nicely in some of these spaces. And now we're talking about like solar shaded tequila or something like that. So I think you're right, is also getting just a small toehold in with the most extremes of like the PV industry, so that they can start to say, look, we do it. And maybe that would also help grease the skids in terms of policy decisions.
I have a question. One of the things that caught my attention was when you said that some farmers were reluctant to save water because it would have implications for their rights. What other kinds of resistance have you gotten besides that one? What have been people saying as naysayers?
Right. So yes, besides that, one has been, I don't know that I could get my tractors in there. And so that's when the Biosphere installation was actually like my third generation. I started with just single solar panels. See about. And so when we did that first installation in the US, we actually raised the solar panels about 9 feet so that you could get an average, single farmer kind of tractor through there. So then the question was, what if I need to apply fertilizer? What if I need to apply pesticide? And so those constraints, because you can tell this is kind of like a fire hose of opportunities and possibilities, we've just been tabling those. So going back to Laura's question about, what about corn or cotton, some of these things that require certain machinery, it's like, well, we're not sure. There's plenty of other opportunities, so we've just tabled that one. Or that USDA grant is actually with people from Illinois also, and mostly with engineers. Andrea was the only social science person on there. I was one of 2 plant people, but the rest of it was engineers who were thinking, oh, I can just time the tracker so it just gets out of the way, and then you could do larger installations and have the combines come through. So it's a bit about finding what's that right ratio. I feel like ultimately in the next few years, and we argue in 5 years for a DOE proposal, then in the next few years, we can do a little bit more science about what people's primary concerns are and what the limitations of the technology are. And then you can just put these levers into a big system. Okay, I can only introduce this much solar. I want to grow these types of plants. And then we can plug in our bits of information and say, okay, well, this is probably the best kind of system you could utilize in that space. It won't be perfectly optimized, but it'll match your hardline demands.
Well, I think we're going to cut it off. And what I should have done is asked everyone to give you a round of applause while they were still here.
Nice work, Greg. Really cool stuff.
Really interesting piece of research. And obviously, you have a lot of fans and you'll take this to great places. So good luck with continuing.
My last slide was a major thank you to Udall, because it really did give me the time to make that shift from being such a physical science person chasing these physical science grants to pause, think about what was just as large of a barrier and research question, and to take the time to reach out to others. So many thanks to you all.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Greg.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you so much.